Hello and welcome to this episode of Quaker. In this episode, I'm going to do the second of my What I Appreciate About ... denomination. Probably should come up with a catchier name. Oh well. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at Methodism. So we're going to be looking at some of the similarities between Quakerism and Methodism, perhaps what I appreciate about Methodism that is a part of the Methodist tradition that maybe we don't have in Quakerism, and then maybe what Methodism can teach Quakerism, or what we can take as Quakers from Methodism, things that Methodism does really well that maybe we could incorporate in Quakerism as well, if we wanted to. So Methodism, unlike Catholicism, which was the first one, there is a lot more in common between Methodism and Quakerism than with Catholicism. If you're looking at the spectrum of Christian denominations, you might have Catholicism one end and Quakerism would be on the other end quite firmly, so quite disparate in terms of how they work and what they believe and so on. However, with Methodism, we're on very, very similar ground. It's a very similar history, quite a lot of similar beliefs as well, though a lot of things that make them different as well. So we'll have a look at that. We'll look at them in context and see what we can find. So Methodism was founded mainly by John Wesley in England in the 18th century. And as we know, Quakerism was founded in the 17th century, so the century before, in England as well. So very similar area of the world, very similar in terms of time period, much more so than Catholicism, which obviously been going on for centuries before Quakerism. We're talking about a much closer time in history, and so it starts off in quite a similar way to Quakerism. It is a revival movement that spreads very quickly, and looking to shake up the Church of England, which was what Quakerism was looking to do. Now, I suppose from the outset, the difference in terms of what that meant for Methodists and Quakers, early Quakers, so the first generation, is slightly different. So John Wesley, right up until his death, was trying his best not to break from the Anglican Church, from the Church of England. He very much wanted Methodism to stay in the Church of England. He wanted to use Methodism as a way of improving the Church of England, whereas Quakerism, right from the get-go, wanted nothing to do with the Church of England at all. So I suppose that's an early difference. But in terms of their similarities, they are coming from an aim to a breakaway from the Church of England. And there has actually been quite a lot of evidence to show that there was a lot of connection between Quakers and Methodists as they were getting going. There was even a group in Cheshire called the Quaker Methodists, which tried to fit Quakerism and Methodism together into a thing. As it turned out, the longer that group went on, it kind of lost its Quaker bit and became just Methodist. So there is evidence that John Wesley was using, for example, Robert Barclay's apology when combating against predestination and reformed rhetoric as he was getting started. And George Whitman, who's another early Methodist, was also had also quite a lot of contacts with the Quakers as well. So there was a dialogue, then there was a back and forth between Quakers and Methodists. Point to mention as well, like with Quakers, there are quite a lot of different types of Methodists. In the UK, similarly in the UK, there's just one type of Methodist church, but in America there are like hundreds. So I'm going to be probably more talking about from a British Methodist point of view than American. So if you are American watching this and I'm not explaining Methodism well at all, it might be because it's a different type of church. What I also find quite interesting is how much Quakers had changed from their beginning in the 17th century to when Methodism was beginning in the 18th century. And the difference in Quakers, the change that Quakers had seen in that time. Because if you looked at the early Methodists and the early Quakers, they're quite similar in a lot of ways. They're both very engaged, feel like they've been moved by the Holy Spirit in order to evangelize and to spread and to change the church for the better, but they're separated by 100 years. And so, what did the earlier group, the Quakers, look like by the time that the Methodists were about? Well, by this time, in the 18th century, the Quakers were in the midst of their quietist period, where they were having very little evangelization. They weren't wanting to get involved with the world at all. And their meetings had lost a lot of their apocalyptic and maybe more emotional styles of worship. They were more quiet. The social status of Quakers had also changed quite dramatically as well in that 100 years. So they started off obviously as highly persecuted working class people. By the 18th century, 1700s, the Quakers were still not accepted in society, and that worked for them. They were still working outside of society mostly anyway, but they were not persecuted anymore. Some of them were even starting to do quite well in business, and so quite a lot of them had upped their social status from working class to more middle class. And yet the Methodists were where they started. I think there's a really nice, nice. I think there's an interesting story about an early Methodist who came to a Quaker meeting house, and the Quakers there were all sort of looking down at this very scruffy looking individual, and didn't really want him there because he was evangelizing in quite a euphoric and emotional way, which by this time was not how Quakers did things. And I kind of just think that isn't that interesting that Methodist 100 years ago could have easily have been a Quaker. It's like they didn't recognize their earlier selves in this new in this Methodist. Not to say that early Methodists were exactly the same as Quakers, but there's a similar passion which early Quakers had as well, which the Quietists certainly did not. So I suppose some things to just bear in mind before we get going in terms of maybe where Methodism and Quakerism do differ. So they do have ordained clergy in the Methodist Church. They do have outward sacraments. So they do the Lord's Supper. They do baptism. They also Methodists have a very high view of the Bible. So in terms of now modern day Quakerism, you couldn't be a non-theist Methodist. However, that being said, I think there are some similarities, and I think I really enjoyed listening to Methodism in terms of a lot of its, especially as a Christ-centered friend myself. I do listen to them, and I think, there's a lot that I think we share in terms of common ground, in terms of what we believe. So I'll just go and have a look at some of those now. So one thing that I think that Methodism and Quakerism really do share is an idea of universal salvation. Now, with Quakers, you can look at that word salvation and judge whether or not that's really worth talking about. But if we're thinking about the phrase "that of God in everyone," we certainly believe that the inward light shines on everyone, and everyone has that. We can recognize and answer that of God in everyone. If we take that maybe a step further and look at maybe what Wesley was more talking about in terms of universal salvation, what he meant was fighting maybe more against the more reformed view that there were the elect. So there were people who were predetermined by God to be saved, and they would be saved, but the others were reprobate and wouldn't make it into heaven. Quakers have always rejected this principle, and so did the Methodists. The Methodists believe that everyone has the ability to be saved. Everyone has the ability to be justified and saved and go to heaven. So this was known in quite a lot of John Wesley's speeches as free grace. Methodists also have quite a high view of humanity, insofar as that, along with Quakers who believe that it is possible to be perfected in this life. Well, not necessarily all Quakers believe that, but certainly if you read like Robert Barclay, and George Fox, they certainly believed that, or thought it theoretically possible. Methodism is on the same, so that salvation didn't just mean being um, saved from hell or being able to go to heaven. Salvation meant also that the soul was purified, and that led to um, a transformation in this life as well. It's not all about heaven and hell. It's about creating heaven on earth as well. Other similarities is that Methodists were also early abolitionists, so were against slavery. um, John Wesley mentioned that. He focused and riffed off quite a lot of what Antoine Benazir was saying, who was a French American Quaker. How many of those are there? And his writings when he was talking about uh, John Wesley was talking about his, or looking to formulate his anti-slavery position as well. So there are they were like Quakers, early abolitionists. So they were looking to ban slavery. They thought it was morally repugnant, morally wrong, and not Christian. What I think is also quite interesting is the effect that Methodism had on Quakerism, because it came, especially as Methodism grew and grew going into the 1800s, it really did affect, for example, a lot of the schisms that happened in Quakerism in the 19th century. Um, and a lot of the schisms were around things like trying to be a bit more Protestant, trying to be a bit more uh, Methodist. So if we look at the Gurneyites, they're called. A lot of what they were trying to do was to make Quakerism a lot more similar to um, the Methodist Church. So they really valued the fact, for example, that about itinerant preaching, which was certainly there in early Quakerism as well. That people would go around and they would preach, and you talk about the circuit routes of Methodist preachers. They wanted to do similar things. They wanted to have a more structured um, meeting for worship. So that's how programmed or structured meetings for worship started to take place. So in terms of the effect of Methodism on Quakerism, it was actually quite profound. So I think what I really appreciate about Methodism is that I think they've managed to keep their zeal, I suppose, a lot more than Quakers have. And I suppose that's for a number of reasons. I mean, not to say that there aren't evangelical Quakers in that sense of wanting to share Quakerism with others. But I think generally Methodists are still have that passion for spreading Methodism than maybe Quakerism has. And there are reasons for that. Quakerism, because the Christian element of in Quakerism is more diluted now, the need for evangelization is less. If we don't believe that the end times are upon us, like early friends certainly did, the need for evangelization is certainly less. And it seems like quite an anti-Quaker thing to do, to try and push our beliefs on others. And because every Quaker, or certainly every liberal Quaker, might have a slightly different view, it'd be very different, because if you had one Quaker come around and talk to you about what Quakerism is, and then another one came up and they'd say something different, you watch this video, you get something different again. So it wouldn't be a clear message. So I suppose that's maybe why Methodism has been able to do that a lot better. But I think even just generally, like their willingness to be very impassioned about their belief, I think, is admirable. I also just think that probably if you're um, maybe if you're looking for you really like a lot of what you read about Quakers, but want a more uh, Christian element that's more strong there. You're wanting maybe a bit more of a liturgical style then of worship. Then maybe Methodism is the one for you. And I can imagine that. I don't know, but if people do leave Quakerism to go to a more churchy church, I would imagine that Methodism would be probably the most logical choice as to where people would go. So, yeah, so I think Methodists, I think Methodists and Quakers have had lots of things in common in their history, a very similar trajectory, slightly different understandings and traditions within their movements, but strong belief in the transformational powers of the Holy Spirit, a strong understanding of the fact that everyone can be saved, that there's not just these special people who um, are saved and everyone else is damned. Everyone has the ability to be nourished by God and to be saved as well. And I think I think certainly Methodism has had a profound effect on Quakerism, especially in America, in terms of changing galvanizing a lot of um, the different splits within Quakerism. Maybe if Methodism hadn't happened, that might have looked a bit different. But I think it certainly had a profound effect on our history. And also, I think that I would probably feel I've never been to Methodist service, but I'm sure that if I did, and especially as a Christian flavored Quaker, I probably would feel quite comfortable in terms of the things that are being said and done. It'd be probably more on the things like the physical sacraments where I would probably feel less comfortable, and in the singing. Methodism has a lot of a big history in terms of hymns, and that's never been my thing really personally, but that's a personal preference rather than I don't have any theological problems necessarily with singing and worship. It's just not really for me. So yes, that's Methodism. If there are any Methodists watching who want to maybe add anything, or if you think I've misrepresented anything, please let me know as well. I don't mind doing another one, making it better. And again, yeah, if there are any denominations which you would like me to do that I haven't done yet, or please do let me know, and we'll see how many we can fit into this playlist. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.